Well, just regarding the armed actions, and again, this is a personal view. It's not the view of Republican Sinn Féin, but would be my view, and it's just on reflection. I would feel, I'm going back to the point that I made earlier about creating that environment, and the kind of decisions that Republicans need to make and traditional Republicans need to make. I would feel myself, bearing in mind the point that I made about the principle that's there, and as I said, there's a principle about the right to engage in armed action. The actual engagement in it and so on, as I said, is a tactical one. And I would feel that in the present climate, in the present moment that we're in, that it's not one that's conducive to armed actions. In fact, I think it's actually, from a point of view of advancing Republican goals, I think it's actually counterproductive. I think one only has to look at any of the actions that have occurred over the last number of years. None of them have advanced in any way the Republican goal. If anything, they've set it back. At times where kind of traditional Republicanism might be making some small progress, my experience has been that when there has been an armed action, particularly one resulting in a fatality, it's, the reaction to it, the public reaction to it and so on, actually swings against traditional republicanism, and it means that any message that we have to make, any positive message and constructive message that we have to make, is basically drowned out. And if anything, as I say, one only has to look at the aftermath of the death of Lyra McKee, and if you look at what was happening at that time, the so-called new IRA and CERU and so on, from, we'll say, January to that Easter, there had been a number of sporadic incidents and so on, and there was some publicity. And then the Lyra McKee's tragic death came, and, there was just a complete swing. And to the extent that, for instance, even the talks about reviving Stormont were accelerated again and so on. And I mean, since then, there's been almost a silence from groups like CERU and so on because of the public backlash. I know that they issued statements of, denying that there was any impact on them, but I mean, the reality is that there was, much as there was in the aftermath of Oma. So I suppose what I'm saying is, from a traditional Republican point of view, one has to look at what is, there's two elements of it. I think there's the morality of it and there's the practical implementation. And I think, first of all, I think there is no armed campaigns happening at the moment. There are sporadic actions and so on. And I think from a moral point of view, two aspects to that. One is the morality of sending out young men or women to either take a life or possibly lose their own, or possibly face 10, 15, 20 years in jail. I think morally is not justifiable at this present moment in time. I just think that it's just not something that's justified. For there is no campaign, and those actions that are happening, as I say, are actually working counterproductively to traditional republicanism. The practical side of it, again, I think, the weighing up the what's gained and what's lost, it doesn't take any calculation to see that what's lost is, I think, the ear of the Irish people. I think it creates a further gulf between traditional republicanism and vast swathes of the Irish people, including a section, and I would suggest a sizable section, a not insignificant section of people who would hold particularly traditional Republican views, but armed actions and as I say, particularly fatalities, would simply turn them off any other message, anything other constructive that we need to convey. And as I say, I think those actions actually strengthen the forces that are arraigned against traditional republicanism and against the concept of an Irish nation, and weaken the traditional Republican position. So I think they're the kind of discussions that I think traditional republicanism needs to have about creating that atmosphere, that environment that I was talking about earlier. The second point I want to make, and just briefly, is regarding the border poll. And I think in this regard, what's happening here as well, and to kind of paraphrase your own book, Gun, Smoke and Mirrors, I think there's a lot of smoke and mirrors going on here with the provisionals. I think part of this whole push towards a border poll is part of an ongoing process by them, where it serves as a distraction to their constituency, particularly their kind of greener, more Republican constituency. That, look, we're doing something about partition, and it's giving them some activity, it's giving them some outlet. to campaign towards this border poll, and this is held up as this great kind of grail to strive for. And as I said earlier, be careful what you wish for, as I said, with all the pitfalls that I feel that lie down that route. But I do think that it's being used by them as well as a cover in many respects, to be able to say to our members, well, look, this is what we're doing about partition. These are the great strides we're making, when the reality, as I said, is much more complicated and much more complex. And I think in the circumstances where there isn't an effective campaign, to do it purely as almost a matter of symbolism, I think to myself, I don't think it's justified, and it's not morally justified, again, in the present circumstances. I think, as I said earlier on, I think that I'm not coming into this with any rose-tinted glasses about where we are at the moment, but I do think that there are opportunities there that need to be explored in terms of how we advance traditional Irish Republican aims and goals. And I think there's a possibility there to do that. And I think there's a possibility to get the ear of people who I think are open to these traditional Republican views. I think there is actually quite a significant number of people. I'm not saying that there's any kind of fast, but I think there is a significant section of the Irish people that are open to that, but at the moment are probably possibly closed off because of the issue of armed actions in the present circumstances. And I think that, again, I think it's something that traditional republicanism needs to look at and needs to discuss and decide where to go from here. I would certainly speak to those that ideologically I would be closest to, that I would certainly, and I know this is not a view that I know there would be a significant section of people that would not agree with this view, but I just feel I'm at a point where I can only speak for myself and my own kind of moral compass, if you like. And I just feel that we're at a point now where I just don't think that such a campaign is sustainable, and I don't think either morally or practically sustainable at the moment. And as I said, it was actually just last night, there was a very interesting article. I don't know if you saw it or not. It was on the Irish News yesterday. And it was about where unionism stands right now. I thought it was interesting because it just shows the nuance that's there, and that this sense that there's some inexorable move towards Irish unity, that's not necessarily the case. There are some unionists who may not necessarily vote for the DUP or the UUP, but when it comes to a referendum or a border poll or whatever you want to call it, would still probably vote to remain. People need to be careful when you work within the demographics that exist. They need to be very careful that there may not be the seismic changes that they might like to think that there are happening,